You can smell the roses before you see the door. Heavy, sweet, almost suffocating. The kind of scent that clings to your skin long after you've left the room. But underneath it, just beneath the perfume and the incense, there's something else, something metallic, something wrong. You don't want to step closer, but the guards are already behind you, their silence more commanding than any order. Inside, the marble floor is cold against bare feet, and the lamplight flickers across walls carved with images of gods and kings. This is supposed to be an honor. That's what they keep telling you. The highest privilege a girl could receive in the greatest empire the world has ever known. But your hands won't stop shaking, and no amount of sacred oil painted across your skin can hide the truth your body already knows. Before we descend into what really happened inside those walls, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It genuinely amazes me that a story buried for over 2,000 years can somehow reach screens in every corner of the planet. If this exploration into history's darkest corners resonates with you, consider subscribing. We uncover the stories that official records tried to erase. The year was 471 BC. The place, Persepolis, the jewel of the Persian Empire, a city of impossible grandeur where columns rose 15 meters into the sky and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with divine authority. 50 million subjects bowed to the will of one man, Xerxes I, king of kings, ruler of an empire that stretched from the burning deserts of Egypt to the frozen peaks of the Caucasus. History remembers him for his failed invasion of Greece, for the battles at Thermopylae and Salamis that became legend. But there's another story, one that Persian chroniclers buried, that Greek historians never learned, that archaeologists would only discover centuries later when they excavated beneath the palace floors. It's a story about what absolute power does to the human soul when it faces no boundaries, no accountability, and no witnesses willing to speak. And at its center are dozens of young girls whose names never appeared in any royal record, whose faces were never carved into any monument, whose suffering was hidden behind perfume and protocol until even silence became complicit. Xerxes wasn't born a monster. He was born a god. At least that's what they told him every single day of his life. When he entered the world in 519 BC, Zoroastrian priests proclaimed him the living reflection of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of light and cosmic order. His father, Darius I, ruled the largest empire humanity had ever seen, and young Xerxes grew up inside palaces where the very air seemed to worship him. Servants tasted his food before it touched his lips, not just for poison, but to prove their devotion. Courtiers approached him on their knees, never turning their backs, never meeting his eyes. Every sunrise began with hymns sung to his name. Every feast reinforced the same theology. You are not human, you are divine, and the world exists to serve your will. At the royal academies of Susa, the Magi, Zoroastrian priest-scholars, drilled this doctrine into him with the precision of military training. They never taught him philosophy or humility. They taught him the metaphysics of absolute authority. Your thoughts are sacred. Your desires are cosmic law. To disobey you is to defy the gods themselves. Imagine growing up in a world where every single person you encounter affirms that you are essentially infallible, that your whims carry divine weight, that compassion is a weakness reserved for lesser beings. By the time Xerxes reached adolescence, the concept of moral boundaries had become incomprehensible to him. How could a god be constrained by human ethics? His mother, Atossa, daughter of the legendary Cyrus the Great, reinforced this corruption with her own brand of dynastic paranoia. She had watched Persian succession disputes tear families apart, brothers poisoning brothers, cousins plotting coups from within palace walls. She whispered a different kind of lesson into her son's ear. Love is dangerous unless you control it completely. Loyalty cannot be trusted unless it's enforced through fear. The only way to survive as a ruler is to possess everything and everyone so thoroughly that betrayal becomes impossible. These weren't abstract political theories. They were survival strategies that would later metastasize into something far darker. When Darius died in 486 BC, 23-year-old Xerxes inherited an empire at its apex and immediately set out to prove his divinity through conquest. Rebellions in Babylon and Egypt were crushed with a brutality that shocked even hardened Persian generals. In Babylon, he destroyed the golden statue of Marduk, the city's patron god, melting it down as a statement. No deity stands above the King of Kings. In Egypt, temples were burned, priests executed, their sacred texts thrown into the Nile. The message rippled across every province. Defiance wasn't just political rebellion, it was theological heresy. But his true test of godhood came when he turned his gaze toward Greece. For Xerxes, the campaign wasn't about territory or revenge for his father's defeat at Marathon. It was about proving the fundamental order of the universe. If he truly was divine, then nature itself should bend to his will. So when he ordered engineers to build a bridge of ships across the Hellespont, a pontoon bridge stretching over a kilometer of open water, it wasn't just engineering. It was theology made manifest. His army would walk across the sea because a god commanded it. When storms destroyed the bridge, Xerxes did something that revealed the depth of his delusion. He ordered his men to whip the water with chains. 300 lashes to punish the sea for defying him. He threw shackles into the waves and declared the ocean itself enslaved to Persian authority. To his followers, it was awe-inspiring theater, proof that their king's will transcended natural law. To everyone else, it was the first visible sign that the King of Kings was losing his grip on sanity. The Greek campaign ended in catastrophe. At Salamis, the Persian fleet burned in narrow straits where numbers meant nothing. At Plataea, the ground forces were slaughtered by Greek hoplites who refused to accept Persian invincibility. For the first time in his life, Xerxes, the man who believed himself immune to failure, tasted defeat. And when a god realizes he can bleed, something fundamental breaks inside him. He doesn't become humble. He doesn't become human. He becomes something far more dangerous. Xerxes returned to Persepolis in 479 BC, but the man who came back was not the one who had left. The triumphal processions stopped. The grand diplomatic banquets ended. He withdrew deeper and deeper into the inner palace, meeting fewer advisors, trusting fewer officials, seeing conspiracy in every shadow. Courtiers who had served him for years began disappearing, executed for minor infractions, for choosing the wrong words, for standing too close or too far away. The empire's administration continued functioning, but its heart was rotting from paranoia and rage. And then his attention turned inward, toward the one place where his authority remained absolute and unquestioned, the royal harem. The harem of Persepolis was not a romantic retreat or a luxury suite. It was a walled city within the palace complex, spanning several acres and housing over 300 women. Officially, they were called concubines, tribute from across the empire, gifts from governors seeking favor. Girls from Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, Media, India, every conquered land sent their most beautiful daughters as living proof of submission. They arrived in gilded caravans, dressed in silk, perfumed with myrrh, their arrival ceremony celebrated as diplomatic triumphs. But once those massive cedar doors closed behind them, no woman ever left. The windows were barred with bronze lattices. Armed eunuchs guarded every corridor, every garden, every bath. Even generals of the Persian army were forbidden entry. Only Xerxes walked freely through those scented halls, and what he did there was considered sacred, protected by divine right and enforced by absolute silence. From these women, daughters were born, dozens of them, possibly hundreds over the decades. But here's what's chilling. They don't appear in any official record. Persian royal archives meticulously documented every prince, every male heir, every dynastic marriage. But the daughters born inside the harem existed in bureaucratic invisibility. No names carved in stone. No mention in succession documents. They were raised inside those walls, taught palace etiquette by eunuch tutors, trained in music and poetry and the elaborate rituals of Persian court life, but never acknowledged as true princesses. They existed in a strange legal and social void, children of the King of Kings who technically had no status, no inheritance, no future beyond those walls. And then, around 471 BC, something shifted. Courtiers began noticing changes in the emperor's behavior, changes that went beyond political paranoia into something far more disturbing. Mithridates, the chief guardian of the harem, would later testify to what he witnessed during these years. His account, hidden for centuries and only rediscovered in fragmentary Persian texts, describes a transformation that even loyal servants found horrifying. The emperor began requesting younger and younger girls for his private chambers. At first, these were concubines in their late teens, well within the brutal norms of ancient royal customs. But gradually, the age dropped. 15, 14, 13. The requests became more specific, more ritualized. He wanted girls who resembled his grandmother, Atossa. Girls with particular eye colors or facial features. Girls who had not yet reached physical maturity. The eunuchs who managed the harem logistics found themselves preparing children, painting their faces with cosmetics meant for grown women, dressing them in ceremonial robes that hung loose on their small frames, teaching them prayers they were too young to understand. And then came the daughters. His own daughters, born and raised inside those walls, now reaching the ages of 10, 11, 12. Girls who had known him only as a distant, godlike figure suddenly found themselves summoned to private chambers deep within the harem complex. Rooms where even the eunuch guards were dismissed, where no witnesses remained, where what happened existed only in the traumatized silence of the children who emerged hours later. Mithridates described what he saw in those girls after such nights. They stopped speaking. Their eyes became hollow, as if something fundamental had been extinguished behind them. Some developed physical symptoms: trembling hands, difficulty walking, chronic pain that palace physicians treated with herbal remedies while recording nothing in official medical logs. A few simply collapsed, their minds retreating into catatonia. Others died from internal injuries, their deaths quietly attributed to illness or accident, their bodies prepared for burial with the same elaborate perfumed rituals that had once prepared them for their father's chambers. What makes this even more horrifying is how systematized it became. The harem administrators, eunuchs who had served the royal family for decades, developed protocols. They maintained logs of which girls had been summoned and when, though these documents were written in coded language that disguised their true meaning. They coordinated with court physicians who provided tonics to dull pain, ointments to hide bruises, sedatives to quiet inconvenient emotions. They scheduled these encounters with the same bureaucratic precision that the Persian Empire used to govern 50 million subjects. Cruelty had become administrative routine. The mothers of these girls, concubines themselves, powerless and trapped, could only watch. Some tried to resist, hiding their daughters or pleading with eunuchs to intervene. They disappeared within days, removed to distant provincial estates or simply erased from the records. Most learned that survival required a terrible complicity, silence, obedience, and the ability to pretend that nothing was happening, even as they heard their daughters crying through marble walls. And the most devastating betrayal came from within the harem itself. Older daughters, women who had already endured what the younger ones now faced, were enlisted to help prepare them. They combed hair, applied oils, whispered the same reassuring lies that had once been whispered to them. "It's an honor. You're chosen. It will be over soon." They didn't do this out of cruelty, but out of broken survival instinct. Participation meant staying alive one more day. Refusal meant joining the disappeared. By 468 BC, the entire Persian court had split into two worlds: the official empire of military campaigns and diplomatic ceremonies, and the secret empire of the inner palace where horror had become ritual. And here's what makes this historical tragedy so profound. Almost everyone knew. Courtiers whispered about it in private. Ministers exchanged knowing glances when the emperor withdrew to the harem. Provincial governors who sent their own daughters as tribute understood the fate awaiting them. Even Zoroastrian priests, the supposed guardians of moral law, provided theological cover, declaring that the King of Kings, as the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, existed beyond conventional ethics, that his actions carried divine purpose incomprehensible to ordinary mortals. The elite of Persia made a collective choice. Their positions, their wealth, their survival mattered more than the suffering of powerless girls behind palace walls. Corruption had become the empire's second religion, and silence its most practiced sacrament. But empires built on hidden suffering cannot stand forever. By 466 BC, cracks were appearing even in the carefully maintained facade. Artabanus, the captain of the royal guard, had reached a breaking point. As head of palace security, he had access to areas most courtiers never saw. He had walked past the harem entrances enough times to hear what echoed through those corridors at night, sounds that haunted him, that made sleep impossible, that forced him to confront the truth his position required him to protect. Artabanus began meeting in secret with other high-ranking officials who shared his growing horror. They called it a conspiracy, but really it was something closer to moral triage, a desperate attempt to stop the decay before it consumed everything. They weren't motivated by justice in any noble sense. They were terrified that Xerxes' madness would eventually spread beyond the harem walls, that their own families might become targets, that the entire empire was rotting from its core. The plan they devised was coldly pragmatic. During the annual Nowruz festival, Persian New Year, when the emperor traditionally withdrew alone for a night of private meditation, they would strike. Artabanus and a small group of trusted soldiers would enter through the kitchen tunnels, kill Xerxes quickly, and stage the scene as ritual suicide or natural death. The empire needed stability, and stability required both the end of his reign and the burial of the truth. But Xerxes had become prophetic in his paranoia. He sensed betrayal everywhere, in the hesitation of servants, the averted eyes of ministers, the too careful words of advisers. He began varying his routines, sleeping in different chambers, trusting only the eunuchs who had no political ambitions and the girls who had no power. The palace became a labyrinth of suspicion, where every gesture was analyzed for hidden meaning, where people were executed based on the emperor's dreams. Then came the night of August 4th, 465 BC. Xerxes made a decision that would seal his fate. After weeks of anticipation, he summoned his youngest victim yet, a girl who had just turned 11 years old, a daughter born in the harem to one of his Babylonian concubines. For months he had been waiting, watching her with an intensity that terrified the harem staff, waiting for signs of physical development that would make her ready for his rituals. That evening, the palace fell into its usual uneasy silence. The eunuch guards took their positions outside the emperor's private chamber, forbidden by sacred protocol from entering once the door was sealed. That created a brief window, a vulnerability in the otherwise impenetrable security. The tunnels beneath the kitchens used by servants to move food and supplies without disturbing the imperial quarters were momentarily unguarded. Artabanus and 6 of his most loyal soldiers moved through those narrow stone passages, their footsteps muffled by centuries of accumulated dust, their daggers hidden beneath ceremonial robes. When they reached the concealed entrance to the emperor's chamber, they could hear sounds from within, a child's muffled crying, the ragged breathing of a man lost to obsession. What they saw when they pushed open that door would haunt their testimonies for the rest of their lives. Xerxes, the King of Kings, the man who had commanded armies of 1 million soldiers, who had proclaimed himself God incarnate, was restraining a small girl whose body was too young for what he was attempting. His face was unrecognizable, contorted into something beyond reason, beyond humanity, slick with sweat, and stripped of any pretense of divine majesty. The carefully constructed myth of royal godhood shattered in that moment. This wasn't a deity. This was a man so corrupted by unchecked power that he had become a predator feeding on the most defenseless victims imaginable. Artabanus moved first. One thrust straight through the ribs, piercing the heart. Xerxes turned, eyes wide, not with pain or fear, but with genuine incomprehension, as if the universe itself had betrayed its fundamental order. His last words, recorded in Artabanus's later confession, were chilling in their delusion. "But I am God." The second blade opened his throat. The third, driven by rage and disgust, tore through his abdomen. The King of Kings collapsed across the girl's body, his blood pooling on marble floors that had witnessed too many such scenes. The conspirators worked quickly. They washed the wounds, dressed the emperor in ceremonial robes, and carried his body to his bedchamber. They positioned his hands in prayer, lit the sacred fire of Ahura Mazda beside him, and by dawn had announced to the court that the emperor had died peacefully during his nightly communion with the divine. The lie became official history before the sun rose.